ia, taputo mai ia, te kāu ia, mai ia e tāu i aro. Tū, tapa mai nuku tū, tapa mai rangi tū, tapa konga mauri. Ia umai no te urewa. O wii te ianga nāre ki tēnei te ao whio. O wii te karawanganda tipua tēnei te whakaraurika. O wii te pare atu mai rawe a pipia ki a tāne. Ati e mauri ora. E me I mai o a tēnei ki a kauta ki a tātou. E ui, e wānanga, a waia nei I tēnei ata. Kautau ngā kairanga au. O te ao auora, nau mai ara mai piki mai kake mai. Tēnei wānanga, o te whare wānanga o tākau. E no o wā I ai tātou katoa nā te uru taa, wera ngā āuatanga o te ao. Engari nā te angarau o te ipurangi, ka me I ngā tai ai. Nō reira, e tino me I ki a koutou. Koutou, nā a koutou mai ranga au, e arataki ai. Te whawhai, o te uru tā nei me ki, me ngā kino o te ao auora. Me ngā rerekētanga o tēnā iwi o tēnā iwi. Nō reira nau mai, ara mai, piki mai, kake mai, whakatau mai. Mā te ronga rawa koutou tātou e mana ki tiaki kia tūtuki pai, kaupapa, ka kōrua ea, e tātou I tēnei rangi. Nō reira riri au, pai Māori. Kia ora and welcome everyone, and I'll hand you over to Peter.
Tēnā koutou katoa, nō te whiwhi ke pōwhiri te koutou, nā reira nā mai haere mai whakatau mai. Tēnā koe Peter Jackson, nau tēnei hui whakatūwhara, nā reira e mihi ana ki a koe. Welcome everybody, it's my huge pleasure to welcome you all onto this virtual Spotlight Symposium today. It's lovely to have you all out there, sitting in your various rooms and offices and homes, joining us today. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Peter Crampton, and I am a Professor of Public Health and Kohatu, the Centre for Holder Māori at the University of Otago. And it's my role to provide a few scene-setting comments, just very briefly. And then I will be chairing the first session this morning, which will take us through till just after 10 o'clock. So I'm now going to share my screen, and we'll just go through some scene setting comments together. Just before I do that, I would like to acknowledge and thank Michelle Coleman and the team, and all our speakers and participants today, and of course the e-conferencing team for making all of this possible. So thanks to all of those people. Yes, scene setting is rather complex, and anything I say now will necessarily be a partial representation of our complex reality. Each topic that I raise is in itself worthy of a whole conference. I have two main points, and I'll make them now and then I'll make them again at the end of my comments. The first point is that we as a research community, we as a health community, we as a policy community need to be acutely aware of the ever-increasing complexity of our equity context. It is not acceptable or desirable or effective for us to work in our silos. If it ever was, it certainly is not now. That's the first point. The second point is that we collectively have a role to play in helping to weave the meta-narratives that make sense of our complex world. The meta-narratives are those stories and narratives which weave together the different elements of our work into stories that make sense to everybody and help us all make sense of the world around us. We have a duty to do that, to help weave those stories. My first point is just to anchor us in a definition of equity. This comes from the Ministry of Health. I think it's a very good definition, and I'm going to read it out. In Aotearoa, New Zealand, people have differences in health that are not only avoidable, but are unfair and unjust. Equity recognises different people with different levels of advantage require different approaches and resources to get equitable health outcomes. So that is a very good working definition of equity, and we should keep that in mind as we work our way through our various presentations today. Now let's start building up a composite picture of the context within which we work. I'm putting health equity at the centre of our context. I'm going to start with a few points about our international and global context. We can't have this discussion today without keeping in mind the challenges posed by global climate change and the huge impacts that is already having on equity of health outcomes around the globe. COVID, of course, is a massive part of our context. And as I said before, we could have a whole conference on that alone and its equity implications. Then there's a set of other global trends, some slow moving, some faster moving. And I've tried to characterize these with the words globalization, democracy, and capitalism. The version of capitalism that is prevalent, or at least dominant in the world at the moment, is called neoliberalism. It is a version of capitalism that intersecting with Western democracies, that intersecting with globalization is a very important set of issues that affect and strongly influence health equity around the globe and in Aotearoa. Now let's turn to the New Zealand context. And I put there Aotearoa's constitution, which is of course an unwritten set of arrangements comprising a number of elements, and Te Tiriti o Waitangi, which is at the centre of our constitutional arrangements. We cannot have equity discussions without keeping those factors in mind. We have a New Zealand Health Research Strategy, which was from memory released in 2017, and that was a first. We hadn't had before that a New Zealand Health Research Strategy. That is an important component of our equity context, and it places emphasis on the needs of New Zealand communities. Importantly, we're after a period of 20 years of relative stability in the health system, we are now entering a period of very considerable change. And we will be observing the health system reforms unfold over the next 12, 24 months and beyond that as well. And in particular, I want to draw attention to the formation of new agencies, one of which is the Māori Health Authority, which will be formally in existence by July next year. The board of the Māori Health Authority will be announced, I think, probably this month, or at least in the next 2 or 3 weeks. We also have another agency called Health New Zealand, which will also be in existence by July next year. And iwi Māori partnership boards, which will be formalised throughout the system. Importantly, we have a whole raft of social and economic policy decisions which affect matters such as housing, such as income support, such as education, such as te reo, the teaching of the reo in schools and so on, which have important influences on equity. And that was my complex picture, painting a picture for us which is incomplete, but nevertheless does convey a sense of the complex environment within which we all carry out health research. And I'm going to come back now to my 2 points. And the first was that we, all of us, whether we are researchers, whether we are policy people, whether we are health practitioners working in the health system, whatever our roles, we need to be acutely aware of this complex equity context, because we can only act and be effective if we are aware of that context and aware of the forces which are being brought to bear, both pro-equity forces and counter-equity forces. And the second point I made was that it's our role to help weave the meta-narratives, the stories, that connect the dots, that join these various contextual factors in a way that we can understand them and that we can communicate that understanding to our wider constituencies. So thank you. Those are my few scene setting comments. And we are now going to turn to the first of our sessions, which is 3 speakers. Each of our speakers will be speaking for 15 minutes, and that will take us through till 10 o'clock. At the end of that time, at 10 o'clock, we will have 10 minutes for questions and answers. And please be aware that you can enter via the chat function your questions at any time during these presentations. So please do so. And you can also upvote questions at any time during these presentations. When we come to question and answer time at 10 o'clock, I will read out the questions and direct them to one or more of our guest speakers. Following the question and answer session, we'll have a short break, and then we will reconvene at 10:20, and I'll remind you of that when we come to that stage of our morning. So we have 3 speakers, and I have to give Di Sarfati's apologies. She was on the program as our first speaker this morning. She's sadly had a bereavement in her family, so can't be with us today. I'm delighted that Michelle Mako, who is the Equity Director at Te Aho o Te Kahu, Cancer Control Agency, has at very, very short notice agreed to step in place of Di Sarfati. So thank you, Michelle. And then we have Jason Gurney, who's a researcher at the University of Otago, Wellington, and then Chris Jackson, who is the Medical Director of the Cancer Society of New Zealand. So we're going to kick off with Michelle Mako, Equity Director at Te Aho o Te Kahu. Haere mai, Michelle, I'm going to hand over to you at this point and mute myself.
Peter, I think I could listen to you speak all day. I've always enjoyed your presentation, so thank you so much for that kind introduction and for those scene-setting remarks, which are absolutely on point and wonderful to sort of set the scene for our discussion today. I'll just share my screen. And perhaps Michelle or Patricia, you could let me know if you can actually see my slides.
Yep, we can see the slides.
Perfect, thank you very much. So kia ora koutou, ko Jason Gurney, toko noa ko ngā poi tuku iwi. My name is Jason and I'm an epidemiologist from the University of Otago in Wellington, as Peter mentioned. I'm the director of the Cancer and Chronic Conditions Research Group, a seat that was formerly held by Di Sarfati. And putting this presentation together helped me to realise how extremely special the ride has been that we've been on together within the C3 Research Group, which I'll expand on in a little bit. And I'm joined by today by my wonderful friends and colleagues, Chris Jackson, who's an oncologist in Southern DHB, as well as a lecturer within the university, and Michelle, who's already been introduced by Peter as the head of equity at Te Aho o Te Kahu, our new cancer control agency. And also just want to Mihi to Di as well at this tough time that her and her family are going through. And we're very, very pleased and lucky to have Michelle joining us today to give her presentation on Di's behalf. So just to give a little bit of background, I joined the C3 Research Group, which at that point was called the Cancer Control and Screening Research Group, back at the end of 2010. And at that point, Di had been doing a lot of work in the context of equity in general, and specifically for Māori. And had just come off the back of work that she'd been doing with Sarah Hill as part of her PhD thesis, which was looking at trying to understand the survival inequities that were occurring for Māori with colon cancer. I'll share a little bit of the findings from that study a little bit later on. That study from Sarah Hill led to the C3 study, which became kind of a body of work, really kind of more like a program of work over the previous sort of decade, which has led into my work at the moment, which is my HRC fellowship work, which is looking at improving the quantity and quality of life for Māori with cancer. So our work in the context of equity for Māori with cancer has really spanned about 15 years. And again, as I mentioned, it's just pausing to do this presentation has made me realise it's been an extremely special ride. It's been pretty incredible, actually. when we think that, I started back with Di, and I remember walking into her office for my interview and sitting down, and she said, well, welcome to the Cancer Control and Screening Research Group. It's basically just me. And then feeding forward to sort of a decade later, and now after creating all of this body of evidence, as well as others from around the country making important contributions, Di is now the chief executive of our new cancer control agency. She is a woman who has absolutely taken that evidence, created the energy and created action, and is walking the talk and putting in every day, working to try to create equity and cancer outcomes for Māori. And I'm very privileged to call her my mentor. So I'm going to give you just a very whistle-stop tour of some of the current evidence. I mean, as Peter said, there's a bunch of things that we could focus an entire symposium on today. So I'm going to give you an absolute whistle-stop tour of the sort of evidence that we've gotten to over the last sort of 10, 15-ish years of research. And really it boils down to 4 key cancer problems that are faced by Māori. Then I'll hand over to Chris to talk about how, now that we have that information, how do we create energy and influence decision makers as that sort of necessary step towards creating the change that we want to see. And Chris is an absolutely wonderful person to speak about that. He is the consummate example of energy, full stop. And then Chris will hand over to Michelle, who is walking the talk at Te Aho Te Kahu and putting some of this evidence into real change right now in terms of achieving equity for Māori with cancer. So without further ado, let's kick on and talk about some of this evidence. So I did boil things down to 4 key problems. The first key problems, if we think about things right back in sort of the cancer pathway, the first key problem is that Māori are more likely to be diagnosed with several key cancers than non-Māori, particularly those that have a poor prognosis. And I've just thrown up a couple of examples of papers that we've written in recent years. And it's important to know, if we flick through to one of our recent studies that just showed the top 10 most common cancers that occur among Māori, basically for the previous decade, for which we have good data. There's some really key cancers in that top 10 list that have a very poor prognosis. So lung cancer, stomach cancer, liver cancer, pancreatic cancer. So Māori more likely to get these cancers and are getting quite a lot of them. So that's sort of problem number 1. Right back at the very beginning, Māori are more likely to get some of these cancers. And I guess the saddest and most appalling part of it is that they are utterly preventable. So we think about the key causes of lung cancer, tobacco, stomach cancer. One of the most important causes of stomach cancer for Māori is Helicobacter pylori infection. Liver cancer, another infection-related cancer with a lot of cases of liver cancer for Māori occurring because of hepatitis infection. So these are utterly preventable cancers. Māori more likely to get them, poor prognosis cancers as well. So that's problem number 1 right at the very beginning. Problem number 2 is that once diagnosed with these cancers, Māori have poorer access to early diagnosis for some of them than non-Māori. Now, I emphasize the word some because it's not necessarily the case that Māori have poor access to early diagnosis for all cancers. And if you hear someone saying, well, we know Māori have poor access to early diagnosis or present more late, just make sure you scratch the surface and ask them which cancer they're talking about, because it could be a blanket statement that isn't actually accurate for a given cancer. But certainly for some of the key cancers, Māori are more likely to have poorer access to early diagnosis than non-Māori. So this is data just from a C3 study. This is very basic, straightforward data, just listing a few key cancers and showing the proportion of patients who have advanced stage. So some key cancers there: colon cancer, breast cancer. Māori more likely to have advanced stage at diagnosis than non-Māori patients. So more likely to be diagnosed with poor prognosis cancers, and for some key cancers, more likely to have poorer access to earlier diagnosis. And there's, again, we could unravel this into an entire symposium as the drivers of that, but that's it in a nutshell. The third problem, and this is a problem that in the C3 research group we probably proportionally spend the most time thinking about, is that once diagnosed, Māori have poor access to best practice cancer treatment compared to non-Māori patients. And best practice cancer treatment is 4 words that actually encapsulates an enormous volume of stuff. I mean, we've looked at chemotherapy, radiotherapy, surgery, access to pain management is a recent one that we've just been examining in the last 6 months or so. It encapsulates an entire kind of realm of across the cancer spectrum about access to best practice treatment. The overriding kind of evidence suggests that Māori just do a bit worse basically at every step. And I just want to illustrate that in using data from Sarah Hill's PhD. So this slide is really about access to chemotherapy. And it's using stage 3 colon cancer as an example. So for stage 3 colon cancer, one of the recommended treatments is the best practice treatments is chemotherapy. So what this clump, so the clump of columns on the left-hand side is Māori, the clump of columns on the right-hand side is non-Māori. And what this is showing is that at every step along this pathway, Māori are doing just a little bit worse. They're just a little bit less likely to be referred to an oncologist. And if they're referred, they're just a little bit less likely to be reviewed by an oncologist. And then they're just a little bit less likely to be offered adjuvant chemotherapy. And then just a little bit less likely to actually receive that adjuvant chemotherapy. And then if they receive it, they're just a bit less likely to start that adjuvant chemotherapy within 8 weeks. Now, if you look at each of these individual steps, it's very hard to tease out, well, that's the key problem. But if you look at the broader picture, it adds up to a pretty massive difference between non-Māori and Māori in terms of access to chemotherapy. Non-Māori, around 43% of patients will start within 8 weeks, compared to around 22% of Māori. So look at individual steps, not a heck of a lot of difference. Add all of that difference up, it adds up to a pretty massive difference. And we see that basically in a number of places along the cancer treatment pathway. And it has been, I love, Peter, your second point about weaving narratives, because I think this is an area where we probably need to do a better job about weaving our narrative, because we are finding pockets of this sort of thing happening, but I think we need to bring it all together and weave a narrative, weave a story about what's really happening here. And that way, maybe we'll be able to influence change a bit better. The fourth problem, so this is now beyond after treatment, ultimately, Māori patients are less likely to survive their cancer than non-Māori who have the same cancer. So this is probably one of my most presented slides that I present, and the reason is it's pretty hard hitting. So this is basically cancer survival. This is excess mortality for Māori compared to non-Māori. And the extent to which those blue bars push out to the right of the slide is the extent to which Māori have poorer survival for a given cancer. The extent to which that one little bar pushes out to the left is the extent to which that survival is worse for non-Māori patients. Take-home message here being, for 23 of the 24 most common cancers, Māori have poorer survival than non-Māori. It's pretty sobering, and it's certainly the sort of thing that makes us, this is why we spend a lot of time thinking about what we're doing in the treatment pathway. What is causing this? What is leading to this? Is it stage? Is it treatment? Well, all of those answers kind of change depending on the cancer you look. It's not straightforward, which again is probably to your first point, Peter, the complexity of what's happening here. It's not straightforward. There isn't a straightforward solution. And that probably brings me to talking about these 4 problems in a nutshell. So Māori more likely to get several key cancers, less likely to access early diagnosis, less likely to access treatment, and poor survival for most cancers. Now, these seem relatively clear and obvious, but actually they're really complex and tricky, and they also come on the back of decades of, generations really, of neglect within the health system to deal with this problem. Now, convincing people that there is a problem has taken decades too. I mean, I can only imagine what it was like 10 years before I started. Certainly within the last 10 years, I've given some pretty awkward presentations to some people who doubt that this is real, that we need to be doing anything differently. And I can imagine, Dyer's given some even more awkward ones before that. So really, creating change in this space isn't easy. it's a massive undertaking actually, and it requires a highly strategic approach. It doesn't need little bits and pieces done in little places. It needs a highly strategic and kind of massive approach. And so what I want to do now is hand over to Chris to talk about some of that strategic approach, to talk about how we can think about this strategically and actually make real change. Now that we know what the problem is, what can we do about it? How do we communicate with decision makers to actually create change? So kia ora koutou, I'm just going to stop sharing my screen. And Chris, I will hand it over to you, my friend. Kia ora.
Tēnā koutou, call Chris Jackson, Takawangoa. Thank you, Jace. Thank you, Peter. G'day, everyone. Nice not to see you all. Sorry not to see you all, I should say. It would be really lovely to have been together in Wellington today. I was looking forward to having a chance to engage with colleagues. Thank you for making the time during Zoom for a long day. I'd like to acknowledge our colleagues in Auckland who are doing the heavy lifting for the safety of the rest of New Zealand at the moment as well, particularly those frontline healthcare workers who are currently facing the brunt of the pandemic, and of course all of those keeping us safe by staying home in Auckland. Peter, you've very generously introduced me as the Medical Director of the Cancer Society of New Zealand. I'm now, as of the last week, the former Medical Director of the Cancer Society of New Zealand. So it's my very first presentation as the former Medical Director of the Cancer Society of New Zealand. I wanted to reflect on what happened over the course of the last 6 years, to reflect on what changes happened as a result of both the evidence that the C3 group and others had developed, and how we develop meaningful change and what that change looks like and what hope that gives us for the future. When I started as medical director, we had this problem, and that was, in my view, a problem of political apathy towards the issues facing all New Zealanders with cancer. What we knew from our work and the Concord studies, for example, was that New Zealand's cancer outcomes were worse than comparable countries. And what I'd learned during my time overseas, working particularly in the UK, and from my international colleagues, our relationships with Australia and Canada, was that there were so many things in the health sector that we could be doing a little bit better, that could be improving things for everyone. Clearly, the issues are worse for Māori, but the situation was the same for all New Zealanders, and that is that our cancer outcomes were worse. And there was no real willingness to either acknowledge or do anything about that. We had our very first cancer strategy back in 2003, the inception of which was actually created by the Cancer Society of New Zealand, who got together and started the very first cancer plan, which then got over the line, led by Chris Atkinson, I think, at that time. The Cancer Society led that, and it became an officially adopted cancer plan. But as time went on, the focus went from cancer control to more operational health targets, particularly in secondary care. Things like ensuring that people with advanced cancer had rapid access to specialists, but really they were targets that were cosmetic, and they weren't really addressing some of the underlying health systems issues. It was correct to say that New Zealand's cancer outcomes were improving, but in data I'll show you shortly, the improvements we were experiencing in our health system were not the same as were being experienced elsewhere. It's also true to say that New Zealand's health outcomes are better than many other countries. We are a OECD high-income country, so we do better than middle and low-income countries. So I think the question of how well are we doing does depend on who you compare us to. I think it is much like the All Blacks playing Georgia. We look very good. When we play the Springboks, perhaps we don't look quite so good. So it really does depend on who you compare us to. There's one very stark exception to our poorer outcomes in other countries, and that is child cancer. In actual fact, as you'll see in the child cancer graph, the New Zealand outcomes for child cancer are better than our comparator countries. The child cancer outcomes, the child cancer network is in actual fact, in my view, a complete model for how health services should be run. It is a highly specialised, expert-led service with 2 centres directing care, with care delivered locally, with strong treatment protocols and paradigms, so protocolised care, with high enrolment and engagement in international clinical trials. And, you know, for child cancer, they have a special relationship with the access to medicines. They were given control of their own budget, which is the only area of cancer where that happened, and Pharmac controls the rest. Many will have seen the news earlier in the year where the minister took that off the Child Cancer Network, or said they were going to do that, in what was called regularising of decision making, which I interpreted to mean taking something that was working well and making it work just as badly as it does in other areas. When I got back from the UK, one of the things that struck me in my principal area of clinical practice, which is bowel cancer, was that, just as Jason has said was the case for Māori, was that many things we did in bowel cancer were just a fraction worse than you would expect from a high quality functioning system. We looked at local audits, local practice audits, local pathways, and we found several things just weren't working well at all. One of the things we looked at for referral pathways, for example, we looked at some very simple things like, how long does it take for a referral letter to get from the surgery department to the oncology department, and how does that influence your time to seeing a specialist in chemotherapy? And when you break down, at the time, when you break down what is involved in that pathway, what's involved is a surgeon sees the patient, dictates a letter. In those days, it was on a cassette tape. They had to take the cassette tape and leave it on their secretary's desk, who would then get to that in due course and type it. The type letter would then go back to the surgeon for signing. The surgeon would sign that letter when it suited them. Then it would get bundled into an envelope, go through the internal post, land in the oncology department, where it would get triaged and allocated an appointment. We found that the average time for that to occur was 14 days. And I would call that a major administrative delay, which was not at all patient-focused. And it was simply just through a manual process, whereby that letter could sit in the surgeon's desk for 2, 3, 4 days because they might have surgeries or clinics or whatever. Or the typist might be a bit busy or have a day off, whatever. And all of that just took extra time and resulted in longer times to patients being seen, which, you know, we know from international evidence, length of time to starting chemotherapy resulted in worse outcomes. So we changed all of that to electronic referrals, and that shortened the pathway down by 14 days. But these were all just small wee bits along the way. Myself, Michael Finlay, Paparangi Reid, Ross Lawrenson, and others put together the Piper project. The Piper project was the largest cohort study of colorectal cancer outcomes in New Zealand. And we hypothesised that perhaps the performance against a series of key performance indicators might explain the disparities in cancer outcomes around New Zealand. And we analysed data according to ethnicity, rurality, and by socioeconomic status. That project took 5 years of my life, and I think, what do we have, 960,000 data points, a 430-page report, over $1 million in 5 years, and we made a number of very pivotal findings, many of which are still relevant today. These include, there's a high proportion of patients presenting acutely, which probably represents the pre-diagnostic pathway. There's a wide variation in access to radiotherapy and schedules that were used. Perhaps surprisingly, rural patients actually had similar outcomes, and the worst outcomes were found in independent urban Māori populations. And in particular, poverty was a major driver in that. And there were significant variations in several key performance indicators which reflected quality of care. And we figured that a pathway that improved quality of care could lift the standards and the treatment outcomes for all. We presented that report to the Ministry of Health and the HRC, and we put forward a raft of recommendations. I'm just going to go through now a detailed list of all of the changes that happened as a result of that report. That's exactly right. Absolutely and utterly nothing happened. So we had another go. We worked with the Ministry of Health cancer team, and we worked on standards of service provision for cancer. There were 10 cancer streams. I think I ended up being the chair of the colorectal group. And we drafted standards of care that were to be delivered in the public health system to try and drive quality. These were clinician-led groups, but they were not funded. The problem was we were not given terms of reference. There was no tools for implementation or measurement, no reporting of those. and no levers of those either. In actual fact, these standards of service provision remain draft since 2013, and they were never actually officially formalised because there was a reluctance to turn them into actual standards, because the DHBs pushed back and said, if there are standards, then we must, we must fund to deliver those, and there was no willingness to allocate resource to fix the problem. We then had another go. So Ian Bissett, myself, Nina Scott, others in the National Bowel Cancer Working Group worked with the Health Quality and Safety Commission to do the Atlas of Variation, which gave us a real-time report of what outcomes were for colon cancer around New Zealand. One of the criticisms of Piper was that it was a snapshot and that it was no longer contemporaneous by the time it was reported. And one of the great pushbacks on data I found was your data's wrong, your data's out of date, your data doesn't reflect my practice. So we went, okay, let's get a real-time report going that people can reflect on what's going. And we'll use comparisons to try and drive quality of care around New Zealand. And so we spent a lot of time on this, again, using routine data sets to deliver outcome information for various DHBs, to try and leverage change, again, by providing people with information. And again, we had, I think, 2 hours of attention in the media, and then everything petered off. And again, somewhat shockingly to me, providing people with the information about their outcomes, again, did not result in meaningful change, funding allocation, or drivers to improve things. So getting change done in the DHB system was extraordinarily difficult. So instead, we turned our attention politically, and we reflected that one of the issues appeared to be the fragmented nature of the health system, that with 20 DHBs each doing their own thing without the levers to drive change from a top-down approach, saying this must be happen, require those changes to happen, that we were just going to keep getting exactly the same thing again and again and again. So we proposed that what we needed was a national cancer agency, like we have in Australia, like there is in Canada, and like there is in many high-functioning countries, to report on and deliver meaningful change. That was a proposal that was put together by myself, by Di, and 4 other clinicians, and we shot that around the political parties, and that was picked up by Andrew Little and adopted as Labour Party policy prior to the 2017 election. Prior to the 2017 election, no one expected Labour to actually win, but then all of a sudden, the individual in the picture there came to power after Andrew Little relinquished it and took Labour to a somewhat unexpected victory. And then all of a sudden there was a Labour Party policy for a national cancer agency that we then went about seeing about getting enacted. One of the things, though, that happened very rapidly was once Labour got to power, they seemed to lose interest very quickly in implementing the National Cancer Agency. The Director General of Health argued, for which I have some sympathy, that you can't rebuild a strong Ministry of Health if you continually cut off its arms. I guess the flip side of that is that the existing status quo didn't actually deliver those major improvements. And so if we were going to improve cancer, that you had to do something a little bit differently. And so despite that being a Labour Party policy, things did not progress. So we took the view and said, well, if we have a government who adopted a policy and the manifesto was elected upon that doesn't want to change that, we have to talk to the people about what the problem is, and we have to share with the public the story of what is happening with cancer care in New Zealand and what we can do about it. So we pivoted from a policy approach to a public approach, and we started trying to tell the story that we knew to be true, which was the issues with access to cancer care in New Zealand. The first thing we did was we took the Concord results and we started looking at the size of the gap between New Zealand and Australia. Psychological research finds that people find losses more persuasive than gains, and so we frame things as a loss. We know, I think from experience, that everyone likes comparing ourselves to the Aussies, and so we frame things again as an Australian comparison. And instead of talking about percentages and the like, we started talking about people and how that was affected. And we started this campaign, and 19th February 2018, launched our first part of the campaign, which was for a National Cancer Agency and for a National Cancer Plan. And the rationale for that was that New Zealanders were dying when they did not need to. Within 24 hours, we occupied the media for 24 hours. We got both the morning, lunchtime, evening news. And the next morning, I got a phone call from the Minister of Health, who said to me, what do we need to do to fix this? And I said, you need to do exactly what we said we were going to do, which was a cancer agency and a cancer plan. And again, that didn't seem to be enough. So we went slightly broader than the Minister of Health, and we went for the public-facing campaign and tried to talk to all of New Zealand and tried to motivate all of New Zealand to get behind this. We brought together funding, which again, the Ministry of Health declined to fund. The International Cancer Benchmarking Project approached the Ministry of Health and said, would you like to be part of our international comparisons? They said no. Cancer Society said, yes, we'll fund this. So we funded research which demonstrated our cancer outcomes and where they were compared to other countries. What this graph shows briefly is progress in cancer compared to other countries between 1995 and 2014, where we started, where we finished up. You can see the progress in New Zealand's narrow, and that while we were middle of the pack back in 1995, come 2014, we were very near the bottom. And that's again true for colon, for lung, for pancreas, for pretty much any of the comparative cancers you like to look at. So that was, again, a 2-year project, got that funded and started publishing that around, showing that we were at or near the bottom and our progress was low. We then worked with the sector, bringing the sector together, working towards the Cancer Care at a Crossroads conference, which we scheduled for January 31 and February 1, just prior to Waitangi Day, in order to make sure the politicians were back and accountable without there being too much in the news cycle. We had the largest cancer policy conference held in New Zealand's history. It was hosted at Parliament and at Te Papa, and it brought together many experts from around the country. We worked with journalists leading up to that in terms of trying to tell more stories. One of the stories we found people most interested in was the drug access story, which of course is one that I've been involved in telling a lot, but is only a small component of the story, but it does get a lot of attention. And so we told the story around how New Zealand's cancer outcomes were worse and how we were worse off. We built that over the months leading up to it and launched the Cancer at a Crossroads conference. We had Richard Sullivan from the UK, Rami Rahal from Canadian Partnership Against Cancer, David Currow from Cancer Australia, who came over as well. About a month or two before the conference, I met Blair Vining and Missy Vining. Blair was a Southland farmer who was diagnosed with advanced cancer, was told that he had 2 months to live and there was an 8-week wait to see a specialist. Blair was a regular guy, bloody good bloke, strongly connected to the community, but had an incredible sense of fairness about him. And he said to me, that just doesn't seem right. And he's right, it's not right. We invited Missy, his wife, and Blair to speak and open at our conference and to address the Minister of Health directly in the front row and to say why they felt he had been failed by the public health system. A dying bloke and his wife confronting the Minister of Health at our conference was something that was very poignant and again garnered a lot of public attention. At the end of day one of the conference, we had achievement number 1, which was a commitment to a new cancer plan, the very first in nearly 20 years. The Minister agreed to that, but despite extreme pressure from all there, including 86% of recipients, they did not agree to implement the National Cancer Agency. So Blair, in the last year of his life, engaged with the community, and he organised the largest cancer care petition ever seen, which was a campaign for the National Cancer Agency. And he achieved 144,000 signatures for this petition in the last year of his life, and selflessly gave up the time that he had, that he could have been spending on himself and with his family, to tell his story around New Zealand. And that was extraordinarily resonant with New Zealanders around the place. On Daffodil Day, 2019, the Prime Minister and the Minister of Health announced the formation of a National Cancer Agency. And Blair was sitting in the front row of that announcement, so he could hear that his campaign had delivered that. And Diana Safati was appointed as the interim chief executive and then the full chief executive. Simon Bridges tried to jump on the bandwagon a wee bit as well and say that National would do something too. So it certainly got cross-party support there. Sadly, 1 month after that announcement, Blair lost his battle with cancer and he died. And he never got to see the cancer agency become a functioning reality or the fruits of his work. So what did I learn from that? Well, I learned several things. I learned that identifying the problem and providing data is not enough. That you have to identify what the key problem is and communicate this in a meaningful way. And it can be a complex problem, but we must communicate with clarity. That you need to focus on decision makers and communicate the problems to the decision makers as well as to the community. That you can't do anything on your own and that you need a broad coalition of support from partners across the sector to get their energy going. That you must be sustained, focused, evidence-based in your approach, and you must be at all times factual and accurate. That you must communicate not just with data, but also with stories. So head and heart, that is the way to garner energy and garner support. And you have to offer practical solutions. Those who come along and say, we're going to hell in a handcart with no clear pathway to fixing solutions are really not offering a great deal to the conversation other than distress, and that what you need is clear solutions and ways in which you can fix that. And there needs to be a pathway to achieve that. And for us, that was the National Cancer Agency. It was around transparency, it was around outcomes, it was around improving quality of care through a program of work, which I'm now very proud to say is in train. And some of the results of that work, Michelle is now going to take you through. So I'll stop sharing my screen and I will pass over to Michelle.
Kia ora koutou, nei rā te mihi ki a koutou I tēnei ata. E taku mihi tuatahi ki te haukainga, nāna e whakataui a tātou I tēnei wā, nei rā te mihi ki a koutou. Kia koutou hoki I te rangatiratanga o te whariwānanga o Otago, nei rā te mihi ki a koutou ki a whaia ki tēnei kaupapa whakahirihira o te ao nei. He mihi hoki tēnei ki te whaia o dai I tēnei wā, nei rā taku mihi aroha ki te whānau e matinga, ki te whaia e tuaki tona tainga ki te rangaraupa, nei rā te mihi ki aia. Kia koutou, ngā puku mahi, ngā rangatira hoki o te rangahau, nei rā te mihi ki a koutou e whaia ki tēnei kaupapa I tēnei rā, kia ora rā koutou. Kia ora, ko wai tēnei e noho ake I mua I a koutou, ko Michelle Mako ahau, I puta atu ahau I ranga maunga o Tararua, ki te taha o te roto o hora whenua no taitoko hoki ahau. O ko taku mahi tēnei wā, ko au te tumu tuarua mana taurite o te aho o te Kahu, e mihi ana ki a koutou katoa. Kia ora. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today. I do send my heartfelt love and thoughts to Di at this time as she farewells her mother, and I stand before you as probably a second best, but I will do what I can to convey the work that we're doing here at Te Aho o Kahu. So kia ora, I'm picking up from where Jason and Chris left off, and I just would like to acknowledge that much of what's happened has come on the back of many years of hard work of others, and I'd like to acknowledge that. And so I will start this kōrero at the naming or at the starting of the Cancer Control Agency. So as you'll see there, we were created on the 2nd of December in 2019, and Di often refers to the fact that we were flying the plane as we were building it. And so it has been a really interesting almost 2 years now to get us to where we're at now. I'd like to just take a short moment to introduce Tō Mātou Ingoa, our name, and its meaning. So it's very much understanding the way a cloak is woven. So you have all the whenua that hang down, The whenua are the strands that represent services, clinicians, researchers, the system, the whānau, the people who drive policy. They're all the parts of the cloak that hang down. And the role of Te Aho of Te Kahu is to weave those together. So not to be the whenua, to not replace the whenua, but to create a thread that binds all those together to create a garment that actually signifies the services, the organisations, the people that work across the continuum and that protect our whānau. And I would like to acknowledge He Ahuru Mōwai, who gifted us this name as part of our partnership relationship, and it was presented to us in June last year. So this kōrero today is about focusing on equity, and so we need to be really clear for us at Te Aho Te Kahu, being equity leaders, about who we are and about what we do. So first I'm going to talk through all of these kaupapa that you can see here. Building equity is very much about our structure, the statement of intent in terms of how we work. It's about developing our equity focused capacity, but it's about also building equity into the work that we do. So first I'd like to talk briefly about building equity into who we are. So this includes our commitment to Te Tiriti o Waitangi, and I do acknowledge Peter for acknowledging that it is the formation of our nation came from a constitutional agreement between two partners, and that partnership exists today in the work that we do. I want to talk to our structure, the intent that we have built into our strategic direction, but also to look at how we're growing our people. So ko Te Tiriti o Te Waitangi. So as many of us know, Te Tiriti has, I guess it's in a period of ascendancy after many years of debating its value and its role in Aotearoa. We finally have a place in history where we're able to stand quite confidently that Te Tiriti o Waitangi is the opportunity for us to work strongly in partnership with and for Māori. It talks to our need for growing good leadership and stewardship in the system, to ensure that Māori have opportunities to achieve self-determination, that we build equity and well-being into all of the work that we do, but also that we acknowledge and create space for mana Māori, for customary practices and rituals to be part of the work that we do. So in reflecting on our structure, we have a council that guides and advises our work, and certainly is a direct relationship with DI, and quite deliberately and strategically, 50% of the membership of our council are Māori. And we also have a co-chairing relationship where we have a Māori chair and a non-Māori chair, and they take turns at chairing our meetings, again to acknowledge that this is a partnership relationship. We also have a number of leadership groups that advise our work. He Ara Tangata is our lived experience leadership group. And again, we have 16 members on He Ara Tangata, all of whom have personal experiences of cancer, and 50% of that group is also Māori. Again, I'd like to acknowledge He Ahuru Mōwai, who are our partner. They're a really important partner for us. The relationship that they bring in terms of their mana motuhake, their relationship across the Māori leadership sector is really important, and we work very closely with them in the delivery of our work. I'd also like to acknowledge the Clinical Assembly, which represents all of the different clinical threads and strands in this kahu. And so that is again another group that provides advice and leadership through the senior leadership of Te Aho Te Kahu and to DI to make sure that we are delivering the best clinical outcomes. My role was established as part of that commitment to ensure that equity is built into what we do. So we have two directors in Te Aho Te Kahu. We have myself as the Director of Equity, and we have Liz Dennett, who is the Director of Clinical. We also have an equity team, mostly that's sitting in Wellington, but we also have a number of equity roles so that each of our regional hubs has a commitment and a person who's there to help drive and support equity being delivered across our work program. So our vision really comes from the strategy. It's about making sure that we're addressing the issue of having fewer cancers. So that speaks to prevention and screening and all that we can do to prevent cancers occurring. It's about ensuring people have rapid access to treatment and care, that they receive the best possible quality of care to ensure survival. and that we drive for equity to ensure that all people in Aotearoa have the ability to achieve equity. So our purpose, in a nutshell, is to lead and unite the efforts to deliver better cancer outcomes for Aotearoa. We don't do it, but we're really keen to support and lead and help the sector to deliver better outcomes. So again, I won't read all this out, but very briefly, we are equity-led. It's one of our strong driving forces. It's about the way we work with people, the way we build relationships, our acknowledgement that equity is unjust, unfair, and unavoidable, and that we need to deliver differently for Māori and Pacific peoples in particular to ensure that we have better outcomes for those groups who experience the worst outcomes. One of the pieces of work we've been working on recently, and this is one example of growing our capacity and capability, is our whāinga amorangi work. So as you'll see here, as part of the public service change, there's a requirement that all public servants actually have a better understanding of Māori competency and capability to enable them to deliver their work. So there are 6 competency areas: te tiriti o waitangi, te reo, tikanga, racial equity and institutional racism, Māori worldview, and engaging with Māori. So we've spent the last few months working with our staff to describe what it looks like for us if we're being the best that we can be to deliver these outcomes for Māori. And from there, it has a clear range of actions that we'll take, and then also a way of monitoring our performance. But we're also working very hard to develop our equity capability. So we've developed equity analysis frameworks, and we're supporting the implementation of that across our work programs. We're working with our staff. We've also been building equity analysis into our project planning methodology, so that when we're looking at the work we do, we're thinking all the time about who's most affected by the issue we're addressing, and how does our solution ensure that we're addressing those inequities and achieving better outcomes. This includes the work that we do in our quality performance indicators work. We're also doing some work at the moment. It's fairly new, where we're looking at how we deliver te tiriti analysis across our cancer services planning. So this is a piece of work we're doing to look at the future direction of cancer services in Aotearoa, particularly as the new agencies have been stood up. And we wanted to make sure that in the development of our thinking, we were ensuring we were building te tiriti into the way that we work. And we're also working very hard to support te reo and tikanga skills for our staff. So focusing on equity, how do we build equity into what we do? And I'm going to run through a series of examples. This is not the entirety of our work. This is a snapshot to try and, I guess, demonstrate some of the areas that we're focusing on equity. So there are a few main areas we're focusing. One is about ensuring we're measuring inequity. And I think Jason did a phenomenal example of it's not until you expose what's happening that you can really start to think about what the solutions might be. How do we monitor inequity? How do we make sure that we're not just looking at the past, but we're actually looking at the difference we're making into the future? And I'm going to use the COVID example for that. As Chris talked about, we actually need to work with others to find the solutions. So we're really interested in building those relationships. And I'm going to talk briefly about the Māori community hui we've recently concluded. Then I'm going to talk about our work program and some of the key projects we're delivering. And again, that won't be the full subset, but it will give you an example of the kinds of projects we're leading. And then we'll talk about relevant research. So I want to talk very briefly about Te Pūrango Mate Pukupuku o Aotearoa, the State of Cancer report. It's a report we finished late last year, and it was an intention to basically capture the current state, to really make sure that if we're looking to the future, we have a clear view of where we are. So very briefly, as you'll see from the chapter list here, it covers a whole range of areas in cancer control: incidence, survival and mortality trends. We look at the inequities in cancer as they're experienced by Māori populations, Pacific, Asian, by deprivation, through rurality, through mental health and addiction. But also we know that people who experience disabilities in rainbow communities experience inequalities. So it's about making sure we're looking right across the system. We also looked at the workforce and those who are delivering the care to make sure we've got the right workforce and we're planning for the future. We wanted to understand where we sit with the prevention, how we're doing on screening, diagnosis, treatment, and survival. So again, this report was an attempt for us to really paint a picture of where we're at as at 2020, so that when we come back in a year or two's time, we can start to look at how we've tracked and how we've improved. And as we know, and as has already been reported by Jason earlier on, we know that cancer doesn't occur equally across the population, and there are inequities across every step of the continuum. And the impact of that is poorer incidence and mortality for Māori in particular, but also for many other population groups. So now I want to talk really quickly about an example of some of the monitoring work we're doing. So a lot of you will know that during COVID, there was an impact on hospital services and care. A number of hospitals, particularly in that first part of the lockdown, shut down while they built negative pressure units while they developed their capacity to deal with COVID. Oh,
Michelle, sorry to interrupt you, my apologies, but if we could just be heading towards a wrap up, just so that we do have time for questions and answers. Kia ora e hoa.
Kapai. Okay, well, I'm gonna whiz through this very quickly. So basically what we did during COVID is to look at the number of registrations that were happening. And as you can see from the lockdown, the overall cancer registrations dropped quite significantly, but we do see them tracking back up shortly after lockdown. And here's an example in gastrointestinal endoscopy. A lot of endoscopy services stopped during COVID. So we didn't stop monitoring at the COVID outbreak. We also looked to watch as the services caught up, and you'll see through March, April and May that there is a significant effort by the sector to catch up. And you'll also see that for Māori, while we had that initial dip, we were able to catch up Māori gastrointestinal endoscopies pretty quickly. The work that we did was world leading, so we were lucky to be able to publish, and many nations overseas have looked to New Zealand for the example that we've set in this space. Really quickly, I want to talk about our Māori engagement hui. We basically went out and talked to 2,800 Māori. We had 13 Māori hui across the country, and it was an opportunity to hear the voice of Māori. So in our planning, we're thinking about not just what the evidence tells us, but to listen to the lived experience, the whakatau and the aspirations of our Māori whānau to make sure that that's also built into the work that we do. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. I'm moving to a rapid wrap up here. So as you can see, there are a number of projects that we're looking at. We're currently looking at our cancer prevention report to identify what kind of environmental factors and what we need to change the prevention space. We're looking at how we address the barriers to accessing treatment. In particular, 2 areas of focus for the equity team is in the travel and accommodation space and in the development of cancer navigation. We're also looking at the inequalities in care, and as Jason noted, we do see inequities at different stages of the process. So we have a number of projects aimed at addressing those. And I guess our last key area is research. So many of you will know there was a recent health research grant that we partnered with the Ministry of Health and the National Screening Unit and to deliver an HRC, sorry, to basically deliver funding for new cancer research. And the findings of that process should hopefully be announced over the next few weeks. So in closing, that was a really quick trot through the work that we'll do, but I would like to leave you with this thought. Mā te whiritahi ka whakatutuki ai ngā pūmanawa a tangata. When we weave together our expertise, we realise the potential of each individual person. Nei rā te whānau o te aho te kahu e mihi ana i a koutou, i o mahi rauake i tēnei kaupapa, nei rā te mihi ki a koutou. Kia ora.
Fantastic presentations, everybody. Thank you so much material in that. And we've had some questions coming in, so we're going to turn to those right now. And I'll use my prerogative as chair to identify which questions we'll cover and to direct them. And if you want to redirect them at one of the other panelists, please do so. I'm going to start with one from Shane Munn, and I think this one is for Michelle. And it is te aho o te kahu. Do you have the right or the powers to collect and compile data from district health boards, primary health providers, the Ministry of Health, etc.?
So I'm going to partially answer that, and then I'm going to lean into Jason too, because he's the data guy. We are, obviously we have access to the cancer registry, and a lot of that data that's collected through that our team is using to guide our work. In terms of DHB data, we can gather a lot of that data through our existing relationships. My understanding, and again, Jason will know this better, it's a bit more tricky with primary care data because they are private businesses, and we don't have any mandate, in my awareness, of being able to access that data. And the other area I know we really struggle with is in the private care setting. So privately funded cancer treatment, we struggle to get data from there. But I'm actually going to pass that to Jason because he knows the data better than I do.
I think that's a really good summary, Michelle. The only thing I'd add is that Te Aho is making a really important contribution in terms of centralising efforts around coordination of data, bringing data together where it's available, leading the way in terms of what data we need to be collecting nationally and have information to hand nationally. The COVID reporting that Michelle mentioned just before was a really good sort of flashpoint for helping us to recognise that we need information quite quickly. We need to inform what's happening around the country. So there's an entire kind of strand of Te Aho Te Kahu that deals with data monitoring and reporting, which have just stood up actually a bunch of new analyst capacity. So it's pretty exciting times in the data space for Te Aho. Kia ora.
Kia ora. And look, I think a similar question, which might have been answered already, but I'm going to ask it because it was upvoted. And can I just remind everybody, you upvote by clicking on the thumb icon if you want to upvote a question. It's from John Pickering. Kia ora, Michelle. To measure and monitor requires quality data. Do you have some examples of good national data and how it is collected? I suspect you've answered that, but is there anything you want to add? Because it is such a central issue.
And again, I'm gonna defer to Jason to a certain extent here because this is his sweet spot and not mine. Certainly, we obviously, you know, you get out what you put in, and so there are always issues about the data collection processes. So we know, for example, there are still challenges around ethnicity data, which we just have to bear with. But basically, the data that we're using is data that's collected through the cancer registry. And it's what we're using to drive our work. But again, I'm gonna lend that to Jason because he knows the data better than I do.
Sure thing. So actually, the data in New Zealand's really good. There is problems with overreaching and overinterpretation of the data that we have available to us. But the really great thing is that we have now a central entity, Te Aho Te Kahu, led by a person who's really led the way in using this national level data and understanding its foibles, understanding its weaknesses, but also understanding what we can tell with the data. It's pretty actually remarkable at a national level to have access to not only cancer registry data, as Michelle mentioned, but also all inpatient hospitalisation data in one place. Outpatient data, you know, these things, the granularity of these data varies. So granularity meaning how much detail you can gather from that information. But in terms of gaining wide signals, they're extremely useful. An example is the QPO, or Quality Performance Indicator program, that's going on in Te Aho Te Kahu at the moment. The lung cancer report has just been released recently, where we're going to be able to monitor with 2 yearly reports access to various parts of the cancer treatment pathway over time, as well as equity of access to various parts of the pathway. So the data has its weaknesses, but it also has significant strengths, and Te Aho's doing, I think, it's a really good job of focusing on those strengths.
Just like to add to that briefly, if I could, regarding the quality performance data in particular. I mean, the Canadians have really led the way for the granularity of clinical data for individual patients with their quality performance indicator program. And the work at Te Aho has been very much informed by that work, which was led by Rami Rahal, who came over to advise us on that. When we ran the bowel cancer indicators, for example, we started with 230 potential indicators. Got down to 30 that we would like to do and 10 that we could using the routine data set. So there are still big gaps there in terms of what we can answer at therapeutic level, individual patient level experiences. But part of the process is to improve the routine data sets in order to get better access to that in much more real time. And every iteration we go through, that's happening. We've now done lung, prostate, pancreatic, colorectal as the first 4, I think, neuroendocrine number 5, and there's another 8 tumour streams to go in the near future. But that's big work getting on there, and certainly it's iterative, and it gets better every time we do it.
Thank you very much, all of you. Look, we're going to take one more question and then we will need to wrap up this session. I'm going to take the one at the top of the list, which has been upvoted the most, and that's from Andrea G. Are there key messages we can add in health promotion work that weaves the narrative and changes thinking? So key messages that weave the narrative and change thinking. Shall we just hear one suggestion from each of you? Start with Jason.
Absolutely. The key message I'd say that has been quite game-changing when I've tried to share it in different places is just in your dealings, and especially clinical dealings with Māori patients, understanding that their experience might be different to a non-Māori experience. They might have faced more barriers to get to your appointment today. They might be experiencing more barriers, more problems in their life in general. So we need a system that understands that those situations are going to be different for Māori patients and that they might be facing more barriers, and therefore we need a disproportionate investment of resources to dismantle those barriers. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Chris.
Yeah, look, I think for me, the key message is one of empowerment, and that is this is not the best that we can do, and that these problems are unfair and they are unnecessary, and that there are things that we can do to fix that. I think it takes courage and it takes bravery. Peter, I want to acknowledge you and your courage and your bravery that you showed with your leadership for fighting so hard for the Māori Health Authority, and the world needs more Peter Cramptons. So that could be a key message. But I think, you know, the notion that these are our problems, this is our watch, it is our responsibility to solve them, and that by working together with good heart and good intent, working in the same direction, that we can achieve that.
Kia ora, Chris. My family and particularly my kids might take issue with that assertion that the world needs more Peter Cramptons. Michelle, you have the last word.
Oh, kia ora koutou. I would just like to go back to the aho. And so I guess from my perspective, you know, we are multi-diverse range of expertise and passions and commitments and skills that we bring. And I, a little bit like Chris's comment, I feel like it's only when we actually join up, when we connect, when we share our skills, when we share our commitment and our passion, that we can actually create something different and new. And we are in an exciting time. Like, we've got some really big opportunities to shake the bucket up a little bit and actually to be different. And I'd just like to think that as those balls go up in the air with the changing of the system, that as they come down, we do that in a united and connected way. And I feel like, you know, we're really keen to be part of that aho, but we also recognise that the kahu is made up of all of you. Kia ora.
Kia ora koutou. Thank you again so much to all of you for your really superb presentations. That was a marvellous start to our Spotlight Symposium today. I would also like to thank the participants. There are some superb questions which we haven't got anywhere near, and we could carry on with questions for at least half an hour looking at those really, really good questions. So apologies that we haven't been able to get through all those questions. We now have a short break, and I'm going to suggest that we reconvene at not at 10:20, but at 10:25, and Lee Hale will be taking over as chair of our next session, which is session 2, Injury and Disability. So 10:25, please rejoin us again. In the meantime, a comfort stop, and look forward to seeing you back in 10 minutes. Kia ora.